He thought he was about to create the funniest moment of the evening, but before the night was over, the entire auditorium would remember his name for a very different reason. The prestigious Westbridge Academy of Music shimmered beneath warm chandelier light, as nearly 800 guests filled the seats for its annual spring recital. Parents adjusted their programs, donors exchanged polite smiles, and students nervously prepared backstage for performances they had practiced for months. At the center of it all stood Professor Victor Langford, the Academy's celebrated head of piano studies. Tall, confident, and admired throughout the state, Victor carried himself like a man who believed talent could be spotted instantly, and that he possessed the rare gift of judging people correctly. That belief had made him successful. It had also made him arrogant. Just beyond the stage curtains, moving quietly between music stands and storage cabinets, was Claire Bennett. At 38 years old, she wore a simple navy dress and comfortable flats. Her blonde hair was tied neatly behind her head, and she carried a stack of sheet music pressed carefully against her chest. Most guests assumed she was part of the support staff. Most faculty barely noticed her at all. To them, Claire was simply the woman who organized rehearsal schedules, arranged chairs, and made sure every performance ran smoothly. She never demanded attention. She never corrected anyone. She never talked about herself. And because she never talked about herself, nobody bothered asking questions. As the recital prepared to begin, disaster struck. One of the Academy's star students suddenly froze backstage. His hands trembled. His breathing became uneven. No matter how hard the instructors tried to calm him, he could not perform. The program was minutes from starting, and a major piece had just disappeared from the schedule. Frustration spread through the faculty room. Voices overlapped. Tempers rose. Then Victor Langford's eyes landed on Claire. A slow smile appeared on his face. It was the kind of smile that made several teachers exchange nervous glances. "Well," he said loudly, drawing attention toward her. "Perhaps Claire can help us solve our little problem." A few instructors chuckled. Claire looked up from the music folders in her hands. "I'm sorry," she asked softly. Victor stepped closer. "You spend enough time around pianos. Why don't you take the stage and play for everyone?" The room erupted with laughter. Several students looked away in embarrassment. Others smirked openly. Victor folded his arms, clearly pleased with himself. To him, it was a harmless joke, a way to lighten the mood before the audience noticed something was wrong. Claire stood quietly while the laughter echoed around her. She neither smiled nor protested. She simply looked toward the brightly lit stage where hundreds of people waited on the other side of the curtain. Victor mistook her silence for fear. What he didn't realize was that every choice he was making was pushing him toward a moment he would never forget. And somewhere in the audience that night sat a guest who would recognize Claire Bennett the second her fingers touched the piano keys. The laughter gradually faded, but the uncomfortable smiles remained. Claire lowered her eyes briefly and adjusted the stack of sheet music in her hands. Around her, instructors exchanged amused looks as though they had just witnessed a harmless joke. None of them noticed the quiet sadness in the faces of a few students standing nearby. They knew Claire better than the faculty did, not because she ever spoke about herself, but because she was always there. Every morning before sunrise, Claire unlocked practice rooms, arranged music stands, and prepared classrooms before the first lesson began. She remembered every student's name, every performance date, and every scholarship audition. When nervous freshmen arrived for their first day, she was often the first person to greet them with a kind smile. Yet despite everything she did for the Academy, she remained almost invisible. Victor Langford glanced at his watch and sighed dramatically. "Well, if our star performer cannot continue, we still need a replacement," he announced. "The audience expects music." Several teachers nodded. One of them laughed softly and said, "Maybe Claire has been secretly practicing all these years." More chuckles followed. Claire remained silent. She had learned long ago that some people were far more interested in assumptions than truth. Outside the faculty room, the sounds of the audience drifted through the walls. Programs rustled. Conversations buzzed. The recital was scheduled to begin in less than 5 minutes. Pressure filled the air like a gathering storm. Then Victor snapped his fingers as though inspiration had struck. "Actually," he said, turning toward the piano coordinator, "what piece was Ethan supposed to perform?" "Rachmaninoff," the coordinator replied nervously. Several instructors immediately raised their eyebrows. The composition was notorious, difficult, demanding, a piece that challenged even accomplished professionals. Victor smiled again. Perfect. The word landed heavily in the room. A few teachers suddenly understood exactly what he intended. One younger instructor shifted uncomfortably. Victor, perhaps we should simply adjust the program, she suggested. The audience would understand. But Victor waved away the idea. Nonsense. The show must continue. He looked directly at Claire. What do you think? Want to give it a try? More laughter followed. Claire could feel dozens of eyes fixed upon her. Students watched nervously. Some looked embarrassed for her. Others waited for her to decline. It would have been easy to say no. Nobody would blame her. Nobody expected her to accept. For a moment, the room fell strangely quiet. Claire looked toward the stage entrance. Beyond those curtains stood the grand Steinway piano positioned beneath golden lights. She had walked past it hundreds of times. Tonight it seemed different somehow. Larger. Closer. As if fate itself were waiting. Victor interpreted her silence as hesitation. Do not worry, he said with obvious amusement. Nobody expects perfection. A few instructors laughed again. The younger teacher looked away. Something about the situation no longer felt funny. Claire finally spoke. Her voice was calm and gentle. If the academy needs someone to play, I can help. The room froze. Several students blinked in surprise. Victor stared at her for a second, before breaking into a grin. He believed she had walked directly into the trap he had created. What he did not see was the brief expression on the face of an elderly guest entering the front row of the auditorium at that exact moment. The distinguished visitor glanced toward the stage entrance and suddenly stopped walking. His eyes narrowed. Recognition flickered across his face. And for the first time that evening, someone in the building understood exactly who Claire Bennett was. The atmosphere shifted the moment Claire agreed. What had started as a joke suddenly became real. Faculty members exchanged amused glances while students whispered among themselves. Nobody truly believed she would walk onto that stage and perform one of the most demanding piano pieces in the classical repertoire. To them, this was simply a distraction before the audience discovered the evening's program had fallen apart. Victor Langford seemed especially pleased. He straightened his jacket and smiled confidently as he led the group toward the stage entrance. The closer they came to the curtain, the louder the audience sounded. Hundreds of conversations blended together beneath the soft glow of crystal chandeliers hanging from the auditorium ceiling. Beyond the curtains sat donors, parents, music critics, and distinguished guests from across the state. Many had traveled hundreds of miles to attend the recital. None of them had any idea that a completely unexpected performance was about to take place. Claire followed quietly behind the instructors, carrying herself with the same calm demeanor she displayed every day. Her posture remained relaxed. Her expression remained neutral. Yet that composure somehow made Victor more determined to embarrass her. He wanted nervousness. He wanted hesitation. He wanted the audience to see exactly what happened when someone stepped outside their place. Do you even know the piece? One instructor asked with a grin. I have heard it before, Claire answered politely. Several teachers laughed. Another shook his head. Heard it before. That is comforting. More chuckles followed. Claire simply nodded and continued walking. The younger instructor who had questioned Victor earlier watched the exchange with growing discomfort. Something about Claire's calmness did not fit the situation. Most people would have been terrified. Most would have searched for an excuse to escape. Yet Claire moved forward without complaint. Near the front row, the distinguished elderly guest who had recognized her remained frozen in place. His name was Leonard Whitaker, a retired concert conductor known throughout the classical music world. Decades of experience had trained him to notice details others missed. And he was absolutely certain he recognized the woman walking toward the stage. The problem was that recognizing her made no sense. Not here. Not after all these years. Leonard stared harder, searching his memory. Meanwhile, Victor stepped beside the stage manager and gave instructions. Announce a special substitution performance, he said. Tell them we are adapting to unexpected circumstances. The stage manager hesitated. Should we mention who is performing? Victor smiled. Absolutely. Moments later, the house lights dimmed. The auditorium gradually fell quiet. Conversations faded. Programs closed. Hundreds of faces turned toward the stage. A spotlight illuminated the grand piano waiting at center stage. The polished black instrument gleamed beneath the lights like a monument. Then the announcer's voice echoed through the room. Ladies and gentlemen, due to unforeseen circumstances, tonight's next performance will be presented by Claire Bennett. A ripple of confusion spread through the audience. Nobody recognized the name. Victor folded his arms, already anticipating the awkwardness that would follow. Behind the curtain, Claire looked toward the bright stage entrance. For a brief moment, memories flickered behind her eyes. Massive concert halls, standing ovations, cameras flashing. Then the memories vanished as quickly as they had appeared. She took a slow breath. The room around her seemed to disappear. The laughter, the whispers, the assumptions, none of it mattered anymore. Victor gestured toward the stage with theatrical politeness. After you. He believed he was sending an ordinary woman toward public embarrassment. But destiny has a strange sense of timing. And somewhere in the front row, Leonard Whitaker suddenly remembered exactly where he had seen Claire Bennett before. When the realization struck him, the color drained from his face. Leonard Whitaker could feel his heartbeat quicken as Claire stepped through the curtain and into the spotlight. For several seconds, he simply stared, unable to reconcile the image before him with the memory stored deep inside his mind. The woman crossing the stage wore a modest navy dress. She carried no aura of celebrity. No security team followed her. No announcement celebrated her achievements. To everyone else, she looked like an ordinary staff member who had wandered onto the wrong stage. But Leonard knew better. Or at least he thought he did. Claire moved slowly toward the grand piano positioned beneath the bright lights. The auditorium remained polite but uncertain. Audience members exchanged puzzled looks. A few glanced down at their programs searching for information that was not there. Parents whispered to one another. Some students in the audience appeared nervous on her behalf. Others seemed amused. Up near the stage entrance, Victor Langford stood comfortably with his arms crossed. He was enjoying every second. In his mind, the evening had transformed from a logistical problem into an entertaining lesson about staying in one's lane. He imagined the awkward pauses that would follow. He imagined the uncomfortable mistakes. Most of all, he imagined the laughter afterward. Beside him, the younger instructor watched silently. The longer she observed Claire, the more unsettled she became. There was something unusual about the way Claire approached the piano. Not confidence exactly. Something deeper. Familiarity. As if she had walked onto stages much larger than this one. Claire reached the piano bench and stopped. For a brief moment, she simply stood there, gazing at the polished black instrument. The auditorium grew quieter. The grand piano reflected the stage lights like a dark mirror. She gently placed her fingertips against its edge. The gesture seemed small, almost insignificant, yet something changed in her expression. The years appeared to fall away. The uncertainty others projected onto her vanished completely. Across the room, Leonard leaned forward in his seat. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. A concert hall in Vienna. Thousands of spectators. A young woman receiving a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. He remembered the newspapers, the interviews, the headlines describing a once-in-a-generation pianist. Then, almost overnight, she had disappeared. No farewell tour. No explanation. Just silence. Leonard's eyes widened. It could not be. Yet every passing second convinced him further. On stage, Claire adjusted the bench with calm precision. No nervous fidgeting. No hesitation. No sign of panic. Victor noticed the composure, but dismissed it. Some people simply did not realize when they were out of their depth. He nodded toward the stage manager. The signal was given. The recital hall fell completely silent. Hundreds of faces turned toward the woman seated at the piano. Even the air seemed still. Claire placed her hands gently in her lap and looked out across the audience. For the first time that evening, her eyes swept across the room. Not searching, not seeking approval, simply observing. Then her gaze briefly passed over Leonard Whitaker. Their eyes met for less than a second. But it was enough. Leonard felt a chill run through him. Because in that instant he saw recognition. She knew exactly who he was. And if she remembered him, then there was no possibility he was mistaken. His mouth slowly fell open. Meanwhile, Victor Langford remained completely unaware that the foundation beneath his assumptions was about to crack. The room waited. The piano waited. And as Claire finally lifted her hands toward the keys, 800 people unknowingly sat on the edge of a moment that would be talked about for years. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The silence inside the auditorium felt almost physical, stretching across rows of seats and wrapping itself around every person in the room. Claire sat perfectly still at the piano bench, her hands hovering just above the keys. To the audience, it appeared she might finally be feeling nervous. Victor Langford certainly thought so. A satisfied smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. In his mind, reality was finally catching up with her. He imagined her realizing the impossible situation she had stepped into. 800 people watching. One of the most difficult pieces in classical music waiting before her. No escape. No excuse. No way to hide. Yet the truth could not have been more different. Claire was not afraid of the audience. She was not intimidated by the piano. She was remembering. Somewhere deep inside her mind, memories resurfaced like distant echoes. Endless hours of practice. Early mornings before sunrise. International competitions. Concert halls filled with thousands of listeners. The weight of expectation. The pressure. The applause. And then the silence that followed when she chose to walk away from it all. For 10 years, she had carefully built a quieter life. A simpler life. A life where nobody expected perfection. A life where nobody cared whether she won or lost. Yet now fate had brought her back to a stage when she least expected it. Across the room, Leonard Whitaker watched with growing anticipation. He knew exactly what he was looking at now. Not uncertainty. Not hesitation. Preparation. The kind of preparation only elite performers understood. He had witnessed it countless times throughout his career. The stillness before greatness. The moment when an artist disappeared into the music before playing a single note. Leonard glanced toward Victor. The professor remained completely unaware. In fact, Victor looked almost bored. He checked his watch. He shifted his weight. He seemed more concerned with the schedule than with the woman seated at the piano. Around him, faculty members whispered quietly among themselves. Some expected an awkward attempt followed by polite applause. Others simply hoped the embarrassment would end quickly. The students were different. They sensed something changing. Perhaps it was the confidence in Claire's posture. Perhaps it was the unusual tension spreading through the room. Whatever the reason, many of them had stopped smiling. They watched her carefully now, waiting, wondering. The stage lights reflected softly across the polished surface of the piano. Dust particles floated through the golden glow. Somewhere near the back of the auditorium, a program slipped from someone's hands and landed on the floor with a faint sound. Nobody reacted. Every eye remained fixed on Claire Bennett. Then something remarkable happened. The uncertainty vanished from her face completely. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing slowed. The years of invisibility seemed to fall away. Not because she wanted recognition. Not because she wanted revenge. But because for the first time in a very long time, she was exactly where she belonged. Leonard felt a chill run down his spine. He knew what was coming. The audience did not. Victor certainly did not. Yet somewhere beyond logic, beyond assumptions and appearances, the truth was finally approaching. Claire lowered her fingertips toward the keys. The movement was smooth, familiar, effortless. The room held its collective breath. One note was all it would take. One note to shatter every assumption. One note to turn laughter into disbelief. One note to begin a story nobody in that auditorium would ever forget. And then, at last, her fingers touched the piano. The first note drifted through the auditorium like a beam of light cutting through darkness. It was pure, controlled, beautiful. For a split second nobody reacted. Then the second note followed. Then the third. Within moments, an invisible wave swept across the room. Conversations that had lingered in the back rows disappeared completely. Programs stopped rustling. Even the faint sounds of movement seemed to vanish. Something was wrong. Or rather, something was very different from what everyone expected. Victor Langford felt it immediately. His confident smile faded just slightly. The opening passage was not merely correct. It was flawless. Claire's hands moved across the keys with a calm precision that looked effortless. There was no hesitation, no searching, no uncertainty. She played as though the instrument were an extension of herself. The audience leaned forward almost instinctively. People who had expected awkward mistakes found themselves staring in confusion. The music flowed smoothly through the hall, filling every corner of the vast room. It was not simply the technical accuracy that captured attention. It was the emotion hidden inside every phrase. Claire was not performing notes. She was telling a story that seemed to pull listeners into a world beyond the auditorium walls. Leonard Whitaker closed his eyes briefly. The sound confirmed everything. There was no doubt left. He had heard countless pianists during his career. Thousands, perhaps. But only a handful possessed this rare combination of control, depth, and emotional intelligence. Claire was one of them. Always had been. Across the stage entrance, several instructors exchanged nervous glances. The laughter from earlier had vanished. One professor slowly lowered the program she had been holding. Another unconsciously took a step closer to the stage. The younger instructor who had defended Claire earlier felt a strange satisfaction growing inside her. She did not know the full story yet, but she knew one thing with certainty. Victor had made a terrible mistake. The piece grew more demanding. Complex passages appeared. Rapid sequences that challenged even advanced performers arrived one after another. Yet Claire moved through them with remarkable ease. Her posture remained relaxed. Her expression remained peaceful. There was no visible strain, no dramatic display, only quiet mastery. Victor's stomach tightened. He told himself it was coincidence. Perhaps she had memorized portions of the piece years ago. Perhaps she was simply having an unusually good performance. Yet every passing second made those explanations feel weaker. The audience sensed it too. People no longer looked confused. They looked captivated. A hush settled over the room, unlike anything the Academy had experienced in years. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody whispered. Nobody moved. The room went silent. Completely silent. The music continued rising. Layer upon layer of sound filled the auditorium. Students watched with wide eyes. Parents stared in disbelief. Even experienced musicians seemed unable to look away. Claire remained lost within the performance, unaware of the growing shock around her. For the first time in 10 years, she was not an assistant, an organizer, or an invisible figure moving quietly through hallways. She was simply herself. And as the next section of the piece approached, one that many professional pianists feared attempting in public, Victor finally felt something he had not expected to feel that night. Fear. Because deep down he was beginning to understand a truth that everyone else would soon discover. The woman he had tried to humiliate was unlike anyone he had ever met. The music surged forward into the section that separated talented performers from true masters. Every musician in the room knew it. The technical demands became relentless. Complex passages arrived one after another with almost no room for error. Yet Claire moved through them with astonishing calm. Her hands floated across the keyboard with a level of control that seemed impossible. The audience watched in complete silence. No one shifted in their seat. No one whispered. It was as if the entire auditorium had forgotten how to breathe. Victor Langford felt his confidence slipping away with every passing measure. Just minutes earlier, he had been planning to laugh off an awkward performance. Now he found himself staring at the stage with growing disbelief. His eyes followed Claire's movements, searching desperately for a mistake. A missed note. A hesitation. Anything that would restore the version of reality he had believed in. Nothing came. Instead, the performance continued to rise to an even higher level. The music filled the hall with power and elegance, moving effortlessly between moments of thunderous intensity and breathtaking delicacy. Several students exchanged stunned glances. Some of them had spent years studying this very piece. They knew how difficult it was. They knew how many accomplished pianists avoided performing it live. Yet Claire played it as though she had known it her entire life. In the front row, Leonard Whitaker no longer bothered hiding his reaction. He sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the stage. Memories flooded back with increasing clarity. International competitions, television interviews, magazine covers. The young pianist who had captivated audiences around the world. The performer critics once called the future of classical music. Leonard remembered standing backstage after a championship performance years earlier. He remembered the roar of the crowd. He remembered a gold medal hanging around a young woman's neck. Most of all, he remembered her name. Meanwhile, Claire seemed completely unaware of the storm building around her. She was no longer thinking about the audience or the faculty. She was immersed in the music itself. Every phrase carried meaning. Every transition felt natural. The years away from the spotlight had not diminished her gift. If anything, they had deepened it. The final movement approached. Anticipation spread through the auditorium. Experienced musicians recognized what was coming and leaned forward. This was the section that often exposed weaknesses. The section where nerves could destroy months of preparation. Victor felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The room had already turned against his assumptions. If Claire conquered this final challenge, there would be no explanation left. No excuse. No way to pretend she had simply gotten lucky. Then it happened. Claire entered the final passage with such confidence and precision that several professors unconsciously rose halfway from their seats. A visible shock passed through the faculty section. The younger instructor covered her mouth in disbelief. The audience remained frozen. The room went silent in a way Victor had never experienced before. It was not the silence of politeness. It was the silence of awe. And as the music climbed toward its breathtaking conclusion, Leonard Whitaker slowly stood to his feet. He could no longer keep the truth to himself. In another few moments, everyone in that auditorium was about to learn exactly who Claire Bennett really was. The final note rang through the auditorium and seemed to linger in the air long after Claire's fingers left the keys. For one impossible moment, nobody reacted. 800 people sat frozen in complete silence. It was as though the entire room needed time to process what it had just witnessed. Victor Langford stared at the stage with a blank expression. His arms had fallen to his sides. The confidence that had carried him through the evening had vanished completely. Around him, faculty members looked equally stunned. Some blinked repeatedly. Others simply stood motionless, unable to explain how the quiet woman they barely noticed each day had just delivered a performance worthy of the world's greatest concert halls. Then a chair scraped against the floor. The sound seemed unusually loud in the silence. Leonard Whitaker had risen to his feet. Every eye gradually turned toward him. The retired conductor was a respected figure in the classical music community. Many audience members recognized him immediately. Leonard looked at Claire with disbelief and admiration written across his face. For several seconds he appeared almost emotional. Then he began to clap. Slowly, deliberately. The sharp sound echoed through the auditorium. One clap became two. Two became five. Soon a handful of guests joined him. Yet Leonard was not finished. He stepped into the aisle, never taking his eyes off Claire. "This is impossible," he said quietly, though the microphone near the stage carried his voice throughout the hall. Murmurs spread across the audience. Victor felt his stomach tighten. Leonard pointed toward the stage. "Do you people have any idea who that is?" The room immediately grew silent again. Claire lowered her gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Leonard laughed softly, shaking his head in amazement. 10 years ago, every major music publication in the world was talking about Claire Bennett. She won the International World Piano Championship. She performed before royalty, presidents, and audiences of thousands. Critics called her one of the greatest pianists of her generation. A collective gasp swept through the auditorium. Students looked at one another in shock. Parents exchanged stunned expressions. Faculty members visibly paled. Victor's face lost all color. Leonard continued speaking. "I conducted an orchestra for her championship performance. I would recognize that artistry anywhere. There is not another pianist alive who sounds quite like Claire Bennett." The room exploded with whispers. People reached for their phones. Others searched the internet. Within seconds, images began appearing on screens throughout the audience. Magazine covers, competition photographs, newspaper headlines. There she was, younger, standing beside a grand piano with a gold medal around her neck. The resemblance was undeniable. One student held up a phone toward a nearby professor. The professor's eyes widened in disbelief. Victor felt as though the floor beneath him had disappeared. Every joke, every assumption, every dismissive comment replayed in his mind. He had spent years teaching students not to underestimate talent. Yet he had done exactly that. On stage, Claire remained seated quietly beside the piano. She made no attempt to defend herself, no effort to expose anyone. The truth had done that on its own. And as the realization spread through the auditorium, a hush fell over the crowd once more. Not because of confusion this time, because everyone had suddenly understood the same lesson. The woman they had treated as invisible had been extraordinary all along. For several seconds after Leonard finished speaking, nobody seemed capable of processing what they had heard. Then the applause began. A few people stood, then dozens, then hundreds. Within moments, the entire auditorium rose to its feet. The standing ovation rolled through the hall like a wave. Parents applauded. Students applauded. Donors applauded. Even the professors who had laughed earlier now found themselves clapping with stunned expressions. The sound filled every corner of the building. Claire remained seated for a moment beside the piano, looking almost overwhelmed by the reaction. She had not stepped onto the stage seeking recognition. She had not come to prove anyone wrong. She had simply answered a request for help. Yet somehow the truth had found its way into the spotlight. Victor Langford stood motionless near the curtain. The applause seemed distant to him. His mind replayed the evening from beginning to end. The jokes, the assumptions, the careless comments. Every moment now felt heavier than before. For years he had believed his experience allowed him to judge people accurately. Tonight had exposed how wrong he was. Around him, faculty members avoided eye contact. The younger instructor who had questioned him earlier watched quietly. She felt no satisfaction in his embarrassment, only a reminder of how easily people overlook those who choose humility over attention. On stage, Claire finally rose from the bench. The standing ovation continued. Some audience members wiped away tears. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Students who had barely spoken to her before now looked at her with admiration. Leonard Whitaker smiled warmly and nodded. Claire returned the gesture with a grateful smile. Then, to everyone's surprise, she walked directly toward Victor. The applause gradually softened as people noticed the interaction. Victor swallowed hard. For perhaps the first time in his career, he did not know what to say. "Claire," he began quietly, his voice strained with regret. "I owe you an apology." The words seemed difficult for him to speak, yet he continued. "I judged you without knowing you. I treated you unfairly. I am truly sorry." The auditorium fell silent once again. Claire studied him for a moment. There was no anger in her eyes, no desire for revenge, no satisfaction in seeing him humbled. "Thank you, Professor," she replied gently. But this was never about proving anyone wrong. Victor lowered his gaze. Claire smiled softly. Sometimes people carry accomplishments quietly. That does not make them any less real. The words landed with remarkable force because they were spoken without bitterness. They were simply true. A hush fell across the room. In that moment, many people realized the greatest thing about Claire Bennett was not her talent. It was her character. She could have humiliated those who mocked her. She could have reminded everyone of her achievements. Instead, she chose grace. A few minutes later, as the applause slowly faded and the recital prepared to continue, Claire stepped away from the spotlight. She returned toward the backstage area she had occupied for years. The same hallways, the same quiet spaces. Yet nothing felt quite the same anymore. Not because people had finally discovered her accomplishments, but because they had learned something far more important. The measure of a person is not found in titles, appearances, or assumptions. It is found in character. And that night, everyone in the auditorium remembered what dignity looks like.